Good morning everybody, welcome to the Facebook Live and then the video for today when we're looking at some of the women in the Bible. And today we're going to be looking at the story of Bathsheba and what happened to her. I need to tell you that we're going to be talking about things which, if you're watching with children, may lead them to ask you awkward questions. So please do think about that before you let them watch all of this video, in case you don't want to talk to them about those things at the moment. It's the first time my phone's run. I normally put it away. Sorry about that, guys. So we're going to start looking at chapter 11 in 2 Samuel, and this is beginning at verse 1. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him. They ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. It happened late one afternoon when David rose from his couch and was walking about on the roof to the king's house, that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. David sent someone to inquire about the woman. It was reported, "This is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite." So David sent messengers to get her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she was purifying herself after her period. Then she returned to her house. The woman conceived, and she sent and told David, "I am pregnant." So David sent word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked how Joab and the people fared and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." Uriah went out of the king's house, and there followed him a present from the king. But Uriah slept at the entrance of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. When they told David, Uriah did not go down to his house. David said to Uriah, "You have just come from a journey. Why did you not go down to your house?" Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah remain in booths, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go down to my house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do such a thing." Then David said to Uriah, "Remain here today also, and tomorrow I will send you back." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day. On the next day, David invited him to eat and drink in his presence, and made him drunk. And in the evening he went out to lie on his couch with the servants of his lord, but he did not go down to his house. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. And in the letter he wrote, "Set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him, that he may be struck down and die." So that is a very difficult bit at the beginning of the story. And it's just a very difficult story, isn't it? It's difficult to know how old everybody is in this story, and I actually think that's quite pertinent here. So there's kind of rumours, ideas that David's in his 50s at this point. That might be the case. He'd certainly been involved in a lot of very difficult fighting for a long time, and Uriah was one of his best friends. Uriah had been one of the 30 favourites that David had fought with alongside all through that kind of guerrilla war that they ended up fighting with King Saul. So Uriah was one of David's best friends. And Bathsheba, well, she was Uriah's wife. We don't know how old she was. She was obviously young enough to have a child, but we don't hear that she has any other children. We don't know how old she was, how long she'd been married to Uriah. But she probably wasn't actually all that young. So when I was younger, this story used to really, really annoy me. This story used to really, really wind me up, because David is portrayed as this great hero, and yet he does this. So for those of you who want to read on, so from 2 Samuel, read on from chapter 11, read chapter 12 and read chapter 13, and you'll find out what happens. The précis of it is Uriah dies, David takes her into his household as his wife. She has the baby, the baby becomes very sick and dies. Nathan the prophet goes and says, what are you doing, David? This is a really bad thing. And David says sorry to God in a psalm, which we'll come on to. And then they have another child. The word that it uses is actually that David goes to console Bathsheba, and she conceives, and they have another child who turns out to be Solomon, the wise king. So I've been thinking about why this story annoys me for quite a while, and every time I come back to it, I think about it in a slightly different way. So David is portrayed as this great king, and actually in one of the storybooks, in this one, it talks about David having God's heart, God seeing that David has God's heart, and that's the anointing. And you can see that with the Playmobil story, it talks about that, and that's true. But David is still human, and Bathsheba is still human, and Uriah is still human. I mean, Uriah comes out of this perhaps in the best light. We don't really know, because he won't go and sort it out. David and Bathsheba are desperately trying to get Uriah to go and sleep with her so that the child can be claimed as Uriah's, and he won't do it. And we don't really know why. And the thing as I get older is that all of these things end up being more complicated than you might first imagine. Very complicated. So there's the whole thing about how long David has actually known Bathsheba and how old Bathsheba actually is at this point. We also know that because Bathsheba is in the ritual bathing immediately after her period, when he spots her, they think they will get away with it. And David ends up having some what would now be described as super sperm that hang around long enough. So it's a really, really complicated story. Then why does the baby die? Well, lots of babies died then. Why does the baby die? But the thing, coming back to this story, that I realise really annoys me most about it, is that whilst I'm never going to say, oh yes, David, you're a great king, I'm always going to worry about the fact that David took Bathsheba off that rooftop, took her to bed, got her pregnant, then killed her husband. But I know as I get older, these things are always much more complicated than maybe you first think about. David says sorry, and he writes this beautiful psalm, Psalm 51, and I mean, Nathan has to go and say to him, what were you thinking? Exactly what were you thinking? God says, what were you thinking? And this is David's response in the end. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love. According to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against you alone have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight, so that you are justified in your sentence and blameless when you pass judgment. Indeed, I was born guilty, a sinner when my mother conceived me. You desire truth in the inward being, therefore teach me wisdom and in my secret heart. Purge me with hyssop and I shall be clean. Wash me and I shall be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones that you have crushed rejoice. Hide your face from my sins and blot out all my iniquities. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and put a new and right spirit within me. Do not cast me away from your presence, and do not take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation and sustain in me a willing spirit. Then I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners will return to you. Deliver me from bloodshed, O God of my salvation, and my tongue will sing aloud of your deliverance. O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth will declare your praise. For you have no delight in sacrifice. If I were to give a burnt offering, you would not be pleased. The sacrifice acceptable to God is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. So that's what's recorded, and the title for it is a psalm for prayer for cleansing and pardon to the leader, a psalm of David when the prophet Nathan came to him after he had gone into Bathsheba. A lot of the stories about women in the Bible are quite complicated, and they have complicated sexual ethics attached to them. And it's difficult to know because we don't know in this one. David's looking at Bathsheba, doesn't recognise her with no clothes on, and calls for her. Could she have said, David, this is a really bad plan? He was the king. We don't know the relationship beforehand. We know they tried to sort it out. They know they tried to cover it up so Uriah wouldn't know. They tried not to bring shame on themselves and Uriah in that context. We know that it's very, very complicated, and even David, the great king with a heart like God, made a mistake. I think it's very interesting when it says that David says, therefore teach me wisdom in my secret heart, where he really is. And they end up having Solomon, who's a great and wise leader, and he's the person who is allowed to build the temple. He's the person that God allows to build the temple. So again, God's turning some terrible situations to good. But I wonder, for me, the thing that's always annoyed me about this story is that maybe a little bit of me felt that God shouldn't have let David say sorry for this. That he was too kind, that God was too kind to David. I was when I was younger, I thought this was easily forced, that Bathsheba had no hand in it. As I got older, I realised that, that situation might have been much more complicated than we knew about. And I didn't want God to be able to say sorry. I didn't want God to be able to forgive David. I think that's the crux of what my issue was. And the truth is, even in these most complicated of situations, that God offers forgiveness to everyone if they're repentant. And sometimes that's very hard. So Bathsheba, a complicated story, a difficult story. Fortunately, and I choose my words wisely, we do not naturally know all the ins and outs of this story. But God's there. God's watching. God doesn't stop loving them because they do stuff which sometimes we think, how could you do that? How could you think that was an okay thing to do? God carries on loving them, and he forgives them, and he brings them to a good place. But a place which goes there via a lot of grief and sorrow. So, Bathsheba, a complicated story, a story of horrible, I wouldn't say misdemeanour, but I'm not sure if I really mean that, of difficult situations, difficult and dangerous situations with power and sex and all those other things. But a place where eventually leads us to God's goodness and God's forgiveness. So that's Bathsheba. Next time I look at this story, no doubt I will be thinking something else as well. So thank you for listening. Again, difficult. If you want your children to watch it, talk to them first. I'm not really sure that today is suitable for children. I will probably actually put something about that on the YouTube site. But thank you for listening, and next week we'll be finding out about one of the other women in the Bible. Okay, see you soon.